Okay, I think we're ready to start, Brian. And
After 7.
our speaker tonight is Brian Harrison, KN4R. Brian is a long-term friend of John Allen's and mine from the Charlotte area. I met Brian at the AWA meeting in Charlotte. I bet it was 10 years ago. And we're such good friends. Brian actually gave me an SW3 a couple of weeks ago as a mystery project. So his talk tonight is the radios and filming of the Pan American Airways PBS series Across the Pacific. Take it away, Brian.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity here. And greetings from chilly, but not snowy North Carolina down here. So, okay, well, great. And some of the photos in this presentation are actually copyrighted by the official photographer who took pictures during the filming. And he kindly... So here is Fred Noonan and Amelia Earhart about 10 days before they went missing. And one of the conspiracy theories is that they didn't get along at that point. But as you can tell, they look pretty happy with each other. The way I got interested in this is I was researching the radios of Amelia Earhart, and couple of days after they went missing, Pan Am had the best direction finding equipment in the world, and certainly in the Pacific. And they were asked to help locate Amelia Earhart, and Amelia could transmit on 3105 and 6210. That was her two frequencies, and they heard some weak wobbly AM signals, and they all, when they took bearings, they all went down to Gardner Island, which is now called Nicomaroro. And so I believe in the theory that she made it to Gardner and then died as a castaway. But so anyway, so I was interested in finding out what equipment Pan Am was using on in Guam and Midway and Wake and Hawaii and all their other places across the. So I was still working, so I paid a researcher, a part-time faculty member down at the University of Miami to look through the Pan Am archives there and help me find any pictures of anything radio related for Pan Am. He found this wonderful binder. It's a photo album of Pan American Airways radio installations across the whole Pacific from 1936 up to the start of World War II. And a lot of pictures are in this presentation and some other follow-up presentations I have. For example, here is San Fernando, the Philippines. And Pan Am had a number of locations in the Philippines. And this was one of their direction finding buildings. And they were actually using not a loop, but a diamond, a diamond-shaped loop was on the top of this vertical mechanism over on the left side of the screen. And they were using a couple of receivers with that. And if you look to the right, talking about SW3s, here are two, they look different than a normal SW3, but they're SW3s. And there was also another unidentified radio in there as well. So we're going to talk about some of these. Now here's Manila, and talking about the direction finding. This is part of what Hugo Luderitz, Pan Am, called a double adcock. And these are fixed antennas, 4 typically, and they use a variometer in the center, in that little hut there, to figure out which way the signal is coming from. And at every base in the Pacific, Pan Am actually had 2 of these, had 8 sets of towers like this, 4 of the inner and 4 of the outer. And they used them for different frequencies, and they also used them one versus the other, depending on where the approaching aircraft was. So now, back in 2017, I did not have any Pan Am Airways radios of any shape or fashion. A friend of mine, Rod Bloxham, who's a retired Collins engineer, went to Orlando, and I asked him, I said, if you see anything Pan Am, grab it for me. So out in the boneyard, he came up with this antenna analyzer for artificial antenna, sorry, for I think it was $10, and he kindly sent it to me. So I was online through Rod Bloxham. I met a gentleman named Steve Lyons, who was one of the fellows behind the PBS series Across the Pacific. He was the producer, in fact, the director, I'm sorry. And it's a three-part series. I don't know if everybody's watched it or not, but it's very nice. It was released back in May 18, 2020. And of course, there's a number of heroines in this. Juan Tripp, who was the head of Pan Am, Charles Lindbergh, who was the biggest name in aviation in the world, and he was a consultant, a longtime investor and consultant for Pan Am. Igor Sikorsky, who made the earliest flying boats, the amphibian airplanes, and then all the gentlemen who built all the Pan Am facilities across the Pacific. Now, I got excited about this project because a radio engineer was actually one of the stars, and his name is Hugo Luderitz, and he was the head of Pan Am Communications from approximately 1927 until right after World War II, 1946. And he was actually an RCA man, and he was working with Pan Am because Pan Am was working down around Key West, flying to Cuba, and he was studying static and trying to figure out static elimination for RCA. So what better place than to work with Pan Am? So they did a lot of testing, and ultimately Pan Am liked him so much they wooed him over. So these are the two folks that were behind the production, the filming. Ada Marino, she's actually the creator and original executive producer of Antiques Roadshow, and so she was the head honcho, and then my contact was Stephen Lyons, he wrote the script, and he was the director and the producer, and he'd been working on this for some 10 years by the time I met him over on the internet. And I liked what I heard from Stephen. We talked about authenticity is what he was shooting for. The problem is Pan Am radios are very scarce. And we were trading pictures back and forth, and he sent me some pictures of some Pan Am radios in various museums that he was not able or couldn't afford to rent or borrow for the filming. So he finally came up and said, well, can you come up with some kind of reasonable radio equipment for the filming of the dramatic scenes? And I'm always been one to volunteer. So even though I didn't have any or real Pan Am radios, I said, okay, we'll do something. So I started looking at all the pictures, and for example, the picture in the circle there is an RCA AR-60, which was a very high-end communications receiver circa 1935. The interesting thing is Pan Am used them all around the world, but also on the Coast Guard ship Itasca, which was the one sitting at Highland Island and was supposed to help Amelia find the island. They actually had two of these receivers on that ship. So here's Manila, 1937. They're using teletype over on the left. The radio in the circle is it's not a black AR-60, it's sort of a silver colored. They had made them in two colors. And then we have a lot of very interesting other radios that at the time I could not identify, but they looked really, really nice. And so I started trying to figure out what's all. So I do have a RCA AR-60. So I did have something that I could actually use in the filming that was reasonable. Mine didn't have the data tag, which was over in the far left, but I had a reproduction made, and so we use this in the filming. But it's a very oddball receiver. There's if you search on AR-60, RCA AR-60, there's a YouTube video of a friend of mine, Steve N4LQ, who got this receiver working for me and also did a nice YouTube video. But it's a very nice, stable. It's mainly a CW receiver. But of course, Amelia wasn't using CW. She was using AM. She was an AM proponent. Also had a national speaker. All right, here's another picture from that album. It says 1496 receivers. And this again is San Fernando in the Philippines. And notice the date, 10/15/1941. So Pan Am was still using these receivers up until World War II started a couple of months later. And of course, the first targets of the Japanese were the Pan Am radio facilities and the tower facilities on Guam and Wake and um, the other one I can't think. So in the History Miami Museum, there is what's called a Pan Am airport receiver. And so that's one of the receivers that we were seeing in some of those pictures. And of course, it wasn't available for the filming, but we knew it was there. PBS couldn't afford to borrow this radio. They tried. And and this is the only one in the world that I'm aware of at this point. In fact, I'm going down in February to see if I can stick my head inside of it and take some pictures. But the funny thing is, right now they can't find it, and I'm not kidding about that. So they're checking the warehouse. Now, that receiver apparently was based on another RCA receiver, the AR 1496. And so if you notice, this is a stock receiver here, used plugged-in coils. This was a commercial shortwave receiver. I like to call it the R390 of its day, if you're aware of the R390 and 390A military receivers. Very, very scarce. I know of less than 6 of these anywhere. But notice this particular example, it has a 1 meter on the left, and the data tag is over on the right. And if we go back and look at this, it's got 2 meters on the right. So what's up with that? In fact, here they are compared. An RCA stock AR 1496 on top and a Pan Am airport receiver on the bottom. And well, I won't let the cat out of the bag yet. So just hold that thought for a second. Other radios used by Pan Am across the world were SW3s. And here's one at Manila in 1937. And you can see the plug-in coils inside the nice, it's actually a half of the metal coil box that is a very nice accessory for SW3s. Here's a picture of Guam, 1935. And straight in the center of the picture, you see another SW3. And by the way, this SW3 has a few additions over a normal SW3, and we'll compare and contrast those here in a bit too. Here's Macau. Now, Macau was a Portuguese colony right near Hong Kong. The Brits would not let Pan Am fly directly into Hong Kong because they didn't have they weren't ready yet to compete head to head with Pan Am and their flying boats. So Pan Am set up their operation in Macau, some 30 miles away, and they would bus people, arrival people going to Hong Kong from Macau. So they got around that. But here they're using SW3s, which are 3-tube regenerative receivers. Now, I happen to have a couple of SW3s at that moment and some coils. So I said, okay, if I use an SW3 somewhere in the filming, that will be, reasonable. Now, there was a movie called China Clipper that was filmed in 1935 at Pan Am facilities. And it was released in 1936. And of course, these types of film love to show off the technology of the day. And here's Bogey. And if you look around him, he's got radio equipment, okay, which was the hot technology then. And here, there's actually a Pan Am airport receiver, 2 of them actually, that the gentleman has in front of him. And here's another one. And again, it has that classic national look to it. And though Hugo Luderitz was an RCA or ex-RCA employee at that point, he liked national parts, and he was a builder and he was a modifier. And he would take something, and if he didn't like it, he would modify it to be better suited for what Pan Am needed. And that's part of this whole story. That's also a Western Electric, a large transmitter in the back of this picture, and Pan Am had one of those on each of the Pacific Islands as well. I also had something called a national AGS receiver, which is it was a receiver created for aviation, the fledgling aviation industry, uh, though it was to be used on the ground at airports as opposed to in the air. Has three round coils and very nice receiver. And I did have an example of that, so that would be appropriate to have somewhere in the background. I also had a slightly newer but rarer variant of these radios built for the aviation from the airways division, if you will, and this is called a national RHP. And the big difference here is instead of having three individual coils that you plugged in, this actually has a module. It looks like two coils, but that's actually a rectangular module. And if you pull it out, it's got three coils in it. So this was an attempt by them to simplify. One of their complaints was too many coils would get them confused, even though they're marked A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3. You had to put them in the right order and put the correct ones, the correct set in. And some people apparently weren't doing that. So this was National's attempt to correct that problem. And of course, the next iteration of this was what we know as the National HRO, which has even a different plug-in modules. So what was I going to use for aircraft radios? That was the kicker. And the only thing I had that looked similar was SW3s. But so back to History Miami Museum, here's a very, very early Pan Am aircraft receiver. In fact, if we zoom in on it, it says aircraft receiver model C, serial number 1. So wouldn't you like to find this at a Hamfest? And again, this is another early Pan Am radios that we could not obtain for the filming. And this is another one I'm going down to try to take close pictures of. And again, they can't find this one either right now. So here's some of the earliest RCA equipment that was used when Lindberghs was still at RCA and they were testing aircraft radios. That's a transmitter hanging by bungee straps over in the left part of the speaker. And this is still an unknown aircraft receiver, though it looks very similar to an RCA AR785 aircraft radio if you take that rightmost section off of it. And there is one up in the Antique Wireless Association Museum. And I talked to them. I'm a member, and I talked to them, and they very kindly said, yes, you can borrow ours for the filming. In fact, Duncan Brown was coming down to Charlotte for our antique radio meet, and he hand carried it down with him and loaned it to us for the filming. Now, we ended up not using it, but that's another story. So now, Hugo Lutteritz and Ann and Charles Lindbergh, they were very tight, okay? Ann and Charles had to pass their aircraft radio telegraph license to be able to fly around the world doing survey flights for Pan Am. And of course, both were qualified, though typically Charles was the pilot and Ann, his wife, was the radio operator. And so Hugo Lutteritz taught them both Morse code and also enough electronics theory to pass the test. And the funny thing is, I've read that once they were ready to prove that they could talk, each one of them was set up in a different building with a radio set, and they had a QSO with each other. And they didn't realize that they were talking to each other until near the end of the QSO. So that's kind of neat. So what kind of radios did Charles and Ann Lindbergh use when they went around the world? Well, they were working for Pan Am, so it makes sense that they used Pan Am radios. And here's their aircraft station license. And you can see as far as transmitter goes, it was using a PAA or Pan American Airlines Model 10C. And if we look over to the right, we see it's the emission was A1, so CW only, and 12 watts out, and it had plug-in coils for these various frequencies. And transmitter also had different plug-in coils for it. So you can imagine Ann Lindbergh in the back of that aircraft flying along feeling around for coils and trying to figure out the correct ones to put in and all that, and also what station to call and actually have the QSO and everything else. It's very, very amazing. And my understanding is she did a wonderful job as the radio operator on those. And they went around the world a couple of times. Now, those radios are in the National Air and Space Museum because Lindbergh was basically independently wealthy. And when he finished those survey flights, he donated his plane and the contents, which happened to be Pan Am radios, to what's now the Smithsonian or the National Air and Space Museum. And they were not, we knew of these, but again, they were not available for our filming. Here's a close-up picture of the aircraft receiver. And it's a fairly flat receiver, and you can see it's got two bonding posts on each side to mount it to a bulkhead. And again, it's using national parts, and it's homemade. And all the Pan Am radios were either homemade up to World War II or at least heavily modified. Here's the transmitter, the 12-watt transmitter that they were using. And again, if you ever see one of these Hamfest, please buy it. Okay, look for Pan American Airways data tags there. So now the other thing is, in the next iteration of airplanes that Pan Am had, which were bigger, they started having flight radio operators, and they were the first, in fact, to have onboard dedicated flight radio operators. And here we have one that's sitting in front of what looks like two SW3s, though it's different because they each have two dials, and nobody could tell me what these receivers were. But these were the receivers that were used from, say, 1935 until somewhere in World War II. And these small receivers were on the largest amphibian aircraft in the world, okay? And they were homemade. So here's a national parts ad showing various people, and front and center, you see H.C. Luderitz, communications engineer, with one of the Pan American receivers. So that's that, and he also had a little 10-watt transmitter beside him as well. So we know he used national parts, not just because of the look of the equipment he made, but him being in this ad. So anyway, Stephen Line and I went back and forth, and he said, okay, I'm going to have 4 dramatic scenes that we need to put into this documentary. One's going to be a real early thing of Luderitz working in his workshop. Then another one's going to be in what they call the radio shed, and this is where he worked and designed the earliest his direction finding systems after Pan Am had their first airplane crash, and they were flying 90 miles from Key West to Havana, Cuba. They ended up in the Gulf of America, some 290 miles from shore. And on that day, they did not have a functioning receiver. They could only transmit. So Luderitz is transmitting, we think we're here. They can't receive. The weather is turning really ugly. The winds changed. And they were carrying two paying passengers that day too. So they finally ran out of gas and crashed right near a tanker. And one of the 2 customers drowned. Luderitz was able to save the second customer, but he was hurt in that effort as well. And that's when he came back as he was recuperating. He said, I'm going to, Pan Am needs radio direction finding, and I'm going to work out a system. And he started with a loop-based system, and then he went on to the Adcock, which are fixed antennas. And then the third was Pan Am Alameda. That's the China Clipper. That's when the first aircraft basically flew from the West Coast to Hawaii, to Guam, to Wake, to Midway, to Philippines, to China. And that was akin to an astronaut launch today. And then a 1940 career recap. So what did I have? Well, I had a pair of RCA headphones. That's a pretty good start. I had a set of Baldwin or Baldies, and they're always good in any type of antique radio type of display. I happened to have this carbon mic I had bought off eBay because it had a tag on it that said it was from Colonial Air Transport. Well, what I found out long after the shooting of the filming was that Juan Tripp, who was the head of Pan Am for 50, 60 years, um, he founded Colonial Air Transport some 2 years before he was at Pan Am, and it went belly up. But at least I had a microphone that we could use in the filming that was attributable to Pan Am in a weird sort of way. Here's an actual picture of Ludertz's original laboratory workshop. There's some very rare RCA prototype receivers on the right and some very early Marconi stuff on the left. All we could do is do the best we could to sort of replicate that for the filming. Here's the Key West radio shed where Ludertz is starting to work on his loop antenna. He's using a Radiola 28 receiver, and we were able to find one of those. There was the thing over to the right was a transmitter of some sort, 10, 15, 20 watts for testing. Didn't have any information about that, so we just had to kind of go by the look and see if we could find something for the transmitter. So I went to a local estate of a gentleman who actually owned WHKY radio and TV in Hickory, North Carolina, about 20 miles, 30 miles from where I'm at. He had a big building, 40 by 40, just full of junked cars, junked radios, junks. And I found this in a box, and it's a piece of a Collins radio transmitter. It's an RF deck of sorts, mid 30s. My neighbor kindly cleaned it up, restored it, made it look decent. And he figured out it was actually the RF deck out of a very, very rare Collins 30FX transmitter circa 1935. So I said, well, it kind of looks like the one in the picture. I don't have anything better to use, so we're going to use this as a transmitter. Now, also, I had a radio RC, which also called the RADA, very early, very successful AM broadcast receiver. And I thought I could use the one I had somewhere in the filming on the shelf or on somebody's desk. And so we brought that along. And for the 1940 video segment where Ludertz is looking back on his career, Steve Line wanted a radio in the background, and I had this very beautiful RCA AR88, which is also circa 1940, a 100-pound radio, but I told him I would bring it for the filming. Now, I started asking around Charlotte, talking to all the antique wireless guys, saying, who's got stuff? We need a Radiola 28. We need all sorts of things. And, who can I borrow some stuff from? And luckily, Stephen Brown and his son, Jonathan, stepped forward and said, you can borrow anything we have. And he has a very extensive collection. The oldest and rarest by far are these three pieces of U.S. Navy receivers circa 1919 that were actually used of the type used by the Navy when they flew their first amphibious plane across the Atlantic. And of course, it stopped. It took 19 days, and they had Navy ships at each stop and all that. But anyway, very, very rare receivers and amplifiers, and these would look good, and these were reasonable for a 1919 time frame. And here's a very close-up picture. I also saw some of these at the Air and Space Museum on display. Aircraft receiver, 3-tube affair. Here's a radio compass receiver. And also, Stephen Line had asked for clutter. He'd asked for tubes in the box, radio manuals, radio magazines, radio components, a soldering iron, pliers, that type of thing to sprinkle around the workshop. And so I asked Stephen and Jonathan, and they just kept pulling stuff out and loaning it to me. Here's the Radiola 28 we used. And also, he loaned us a very rare RCA FH horn, which I used with the Radiola RC, the AM broadcast receiver. You can see some books and an audio transformer, some coils, and other miscellaneous clutter in the boxes. And here's a close-up item. And another reason why I took all these pictures is so I could get all the items back to them after the shooting, because I was totally responsible for dragging this stuff up to Boston and keeping track of it all during, on 3 different film sets and all this. So here's Jonathan bringing even more stuff for me to take. So another major contributor is Robert Lozier, he's our dean of antique radios down this way, and member of many antique radio clubs. And first of all, I said, Robert, I need a RCA 100 speaker to go with the Radiola 28. He says, yeah, I've got one, but the back side of the grill cloth is totally shot. So he said, but one side looks real good. So make sure you keep the good side to the camera. And I said, I would do that. Robert makes beautiful replica batteries, and we wanted a whole set of these since all the radios we were talking about actually ran on DC. Pan Am ran all their radios in their aircraft on DC, and most of the like Manila and Midway and all those, they even though they had generators for other things, they still ran their radios on batteries. So these would be good. Robert also had some meters and an antique soldering iron and pliers and heavy solder and all this. So the biggest thing, one of Stevens' radios, the 1919 radios, was a 6-tube amplifier with clear UV 200 and 201 tubes, and they're 1 amp filament tubes, but they're not, they're not gettered. The bulbs are clear, and Stephen Lyons wanted something that we could adjust the filament. In other words, something that would light up, so he could zoom in and add that to the workshop scene. So Robert Lozier kindly had a nice 6-volt power supply that you could current limit to protect the tubes, and yet gave us a knob that we could turn so to make the tubes brighter or less bright. And of course, the Steve Lyon and company, they wanted something much brighter, but I said, this is all you get. And so they zoomed in on this particular scene, and you'll see that in the video as well. So anyway, we borrowed all these radios and items and stuffed them all in my car. My oldest son loaned me some tote boxes and a carrier for the back of the car, and they helped me load up everything into the car. But they didn't go with us. But my wife Kathy, and I went up there, off to Boston. Now, what else would we need? Well, I knew that Pan Am only used Morse code through 1930s. They tried AM. It wasn't dependable. It went much, a 10-watt CW could go around the world. 10-watt AM, 100 miles or two, much less range, and also much more susceptible to static than Morse is. So anyway, I knew I needed some Morse keys and also some microphones just in case they wanted, some microphones in the filming as well. So a buddy of mine, Steve Ellington, N4LQ, loaned me a straight key and a pretty fancy bug there. And we went by Brad Jones' house. He's a mic collector, so he loaned me 2 or 3 interesting looking mics of various ages. Now, one of the sets that Stephen wanted to replicate this scene at one point, a field scene, and he wanted a Nesco CN240. Well, very, very rare set, very heavy, over 100 pounds. Nobody around Charlotte had one, but one of the guys in Charlotte said, oh, Mike Molnar in New Jersey has one. And so I said, well, could you ask and see if I could borrow it for the filming? And amazingly, even though Mike didn't know me from Adam, he said, sure, I'll, you swing by and use it. Just be careful with it and bring it back. And I did exactly that. We ended up not using it in the filming because it was just so darn big, and it wouldn't fit on the shelves of the workshop scene that they had made. So, and here's Mike. And he also loaned me another microphone and some headphones and this, that, and the other. And he has a wonderful collection. The worst part of this was it was in the summer, and since these were all props basically for movies, we had to take everything out of the car up to the fourth floor, spread it all out on the floor, and stand there while all the people associated with the filming, came by and asked questions about the pieces, and decided uh, which pieces would be used in what scenes. And there was 4 different scenes, and I would say 2/3 of the stuff we took up there was going to be used. So then and the filming was going to be like Tuesday, obviously Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. So there was 4 different places. So I had to reload everything in the correct order so that I could take the first layer off, that was used first day, second layer off, second day, and this, that, and the other. So it was a real pain in the what. And I remember it was like 95 degrees. And so they said, for filming day 1 and 2, they said, show up at the hospital in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. And I said, okay. And well, we were sitting at the modern hospital, but we kept looking across at this really crazy looking building that was on the grounds. And in fact, my wife walked over there and I took a picture of her just for scale. Well, it turned out it was the old Tewksbury Insane Asylum. And and it turns out this is a favorite PBS filming location. And here's where I met Brad Coed, and he was the actor who was playing Hugo Luderitz in the film. But this building had very little power, and all the lights and everything, all the equipment that was brought in there had to be powered. All the generators were outside, and all the extension cables going into that building went in through this one door. All the equipment going in to that building went through this one door, and it was just a madhouse, if you would. And this was a true insane asylum. And if you look close on those doors, you see a lot of finger scratch marks. And they were, pretty awful rooms, if you will. So, but they built out one of those rooms as the workshop, and you can see the very early Navy radios that we brought up on the very skinny shelves, and that's why we couldn't use that big heavy radio. And we have the amplifier that lights up down on the about middle in the bottom shelf, and all the clutter, the hand tools, and all that kind of stuff. They had a filming rig that would just slide right into that little thin door, and they used that to shoot a lot of the video. But the hardest working guy in the place was this guy he was handling a big, heavy portable camera, and he did all the close-ups. He was on the floor. He was up on ladders. He was laying on his back. He was all over the place. And luckily, he was a young guy that could do all that. But he was amazing to watch. So here's another view of that same building. This happens to be a lunch meeting between Juan Trippe and Hugo Luderitz, where Hugo says, yes, the direction finding works. And then Juan Trippe says, okay, now we can try to fly across the Pacific. While this was going on, they used a lot of fake smoke too, by the way, water vapor and that kind of stuff. So the next scene to be filmed was the Alameda 1935 scene. And here you have a very good view of the China Clipper, biggest aircraft in the world at that time, with the smallest radios in the world, by the way, or pretty close. You can also see the 8 towers in the background. This is the dual Adcock direction finding system that Pan Am developed and one of these was in California, one was in Hawaii, one was on Wake, one was on Guam, one was on Midway, and then I believe they had one in the Philippines as well. So this was I'm dragging all my equipment upstairs and scrambling for tables and that kind of stuff. And so I brought the National AGS and the AR-60, put it in a little small tabletop rack. I had to disassemble this to get it upstairs and put it back together. I also had the National SW3 over on the right with a microphone, and over on the left, I set the later National RHP just because it looked pretty good. And of course, then I asked one of the producers, I said, how's that look? And they said, well, let's change things around a little bit. So this was pretty much the final, a final shot of that center collection of radios, which are very appropriate for Pan Am, by the way. And like 5 minutes later, everybody comes in, all the cameramen and the lighting folks and the sound folks, they all come in, and Hugo Luderitz sits down in front of the radio and talks on the telephone. Uh, and this picture here is the most enigmatic picture of the of the PBS series, I think. And you can see the SW3 and coils over Luderitz's shoulder. And so I'm very proud of this picture, by the way. And then the next segment to be filmed in the afternoon was the circa 1940, um, and so I dragged this beautiful 100+ pound radio upstairs. This was upstairs, second floor, and set it up. But unfortunately, they set it up way in the background, so you could just barely tell what it is. But we had a Morse code key back there, and a radio manual, which was like an early ARRL manual, manual, and a few other things. And so we did a nice job, but it's just you can't see it very well. But this is a little better picture here. So we had a free day, and Stephen Lyon had said that at the New England Air Museum up at Windsor Lock, Connecticut, which was drivable from where we were at in Boston, they had the Luderitz archive. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. So my wife and I went up there, and turns out they had 4 big file boxes full of paper and some equipment that Hugo Luderitz's family had donated to the museum. So my wife and I frantically started going through all that. First thing we pulled out was a real Pan Am desk mic, which looked very much like the one that I had brought and we used in the filming. So I felt very good about that. You can see one of the many scrapbooks of all the newspaper clippings and all that Hugo Luderitz kept of his career in the back. We photographed a lot of that. They also had a huge stack of Pan Am schematics, and so I asked my wife to sit over there and take pictures of as many schematics as she could. And I think we got through about two-thirds of them in the time that we had, because we had to go back and do some more shooting the next day, bring equipment. So I want to get back up there. But many of those schematics showed what was happening with the Pan Am Airport receiver and the RCA AR 1496. Basically, Pan Am remanufactured those radios to fit their own use and added the meters, moved the meters on the other side, changed the tube complement, changed the radios from transformer audio or transformer coupled audio to RC coupled, and a number of other changes. So, and I have all that, so that's really interesting. The other thing is I finally found out what were those little radios that were used in those really big Pan Am amphibian planes. And this is the first one I'd ever seen, the Pan Am model ATM receiver, circa 1935. Yeah, here's a very nice little picture. It's a regenerative receiver, ran on batteries, had plug-in coils, 1 coil per band, had a logging chart over in the top left-hand corner. Here's a coil. The coils were coated to keep the humidity out. Here's a logging scale for that particular radio. And again, these are what I found was amazing was that we had the largest aircraft in the world at the time, and they had possibly some of the smallest radios, and they were homemade radios being used on these, not military radios, but homemade radios. So next day of the filming, this is the 1928 Key West radio shed. This is where they're trying to talk to the plane that doesn't have a good receiver, and plane crashes, and Luderitz gets injured, and first passenger gets killed, and all that. So we got the Radiola 28 over here. We have our dummy transmitter over on the right, and the microphone, carbon microphone. In the background, we have that one piece of Pan Am test gear and some of Robert Lozier's beautiful batteries. We also have the Radiola R100 speaker sitting on the table. And of course, their folks came in and adjusted all this. Here is Priester. Now, Priester was the number two guy at Pan Am. He had come from the Fokker Company, which was the leading aircraft company in the world. And you can see we put the radio RC on his desk so he could listen to AM broadcasts, weather, and then we also put the horn speaker there. And then in the back, you can see again the nice replica batteries and that piece of test gear. Now, the way they're making this look, this is Key West. The way they're making this look so sunny was outside. They had these huge lights that they were blasting away at the fake windows for the film shoot. So we're inside of a big sound stage, and for this scene, they had built this little plywood building that they're being filmed in. We're in that same building. Here we have three of the Pan Am, two pilots and Priester listening to Lüderitz as his plane is going down. And in the center is the supposed defective receiver that was not on board that day. And of course they listen until the plane crashes, and you know, it's not a good thing. And a little later, here is where Lüderitz comes back to the pilots, who are a very independent sort, and says, "Hey, I have created radio direction finding. You need this, you know, for the safety of our planes and all that." And most of the pilots just said, "No, I don't want that stuff on my plane. And, you know, I'm the pilot. I do everything, and I don't need this." And one of the pilots, a gentleman named Music, said, "Okay, I'll test it with you." And the rest is history, if you will. So they also filmed the crash scene. Now this is very similar. This is not the actual aircraft, but this is very similar to the aircraft that crashed that day out in the middle of the Gulf of America. In this, say they used Lindbergh anytime they were opening up a new mail route, airmail route. They would use Lindbergh to fly that route and do all the handshaking and all the meeting and greeting of all the officials and the generals and the presidents and all that kind of stuff. So he was a front man basically for Pan Am. So here's the what they mocked up in another sound stage for what turned out to be the crash of that aircraft, which I thought was a very aggressive thing to try to replicate. Doesn't look like much there. The whole side would come off. But this was a picture that they tried to emulate on that dummy airplane. And if you notice, up in the front right corner is something that looks like an early Pan Am 2-dial radio receiver. And that's where we were going to have just a small little area for our radio equipment as well. So here's what they came up with. And the little area for the radio is very, very small. And they didn't have any idea what kind of equipment I was bringing. And I didn't have any idea what type of shelf they were going to have. So it was kind of a messed up situation. But here they're doing the filming. You got the pilots up front. You got the passengers in the back. Here you can start seeing they took like 30 takes of everything. It's amazing, you know, so they have plenty of content to go back and pick and choose. So we did some scenes where they had the transmitter with a Morse key in front of it. Sometimes it had a transmitter with a microphone in front of it. Sometimes it had an SW3 there instead of that open transmitter, quote unquote. So they did all sorts of different scenes, and it was going to be interesting to find out, you know, what they kept in the final cut. So you can see more what's going on here. Lüderitz is sitting up in front of the right there at the radio, and two paying passengers are in the back. And here's another scene. This is where we're using a National SW3 as I guess a transceiver, a transceiver. But we got a key, and we got a mic, and we got headphones there. So anyway, so we got through the shooting. Stephen Lyons sent a really nice email to everybody involved, and I charged them just a little bit of my expenses as part of my donation. I actually took off work for over a week as well, so I wasn't compensated for that too. So anyway, the moral of the story is, if you ever get an opportunity to assist the movie industry, please take the chance. I mean, it's a bit of work, but you can help them be as historically correct as possible. And I love to watch movies with radio equipment in it and to see how, how well they did. Okay. And one example, this is a different movie. Okay. This, when we got back from doing that filming, I saw an email from a Canadian production company that said they were looking for a particular radio for the filming of the new version of Midway. Okay. And they were looking for the earliest Zenith Transoceanic, the one they call the bomber model, which has a bomber in the grill cloth. And I knew my neighbor, my restoration neighbor, John Runsky, had a beautiful example. So I showed him this email, started bugging him, and he said, "Oh, I'm not going to let them beat up my receiver, and I'm not going to loan it to him." Well, this went on, and I just kept bugging him, and I think I just wore him out. He said, "Okay, I'll send it." And in that Midway movie, there's a scene where they're supposedly on a submarine at Pearl Harbor, and as Jimmy Doolittle and his B-25s are bombing Tokyo, and they're listening to a Japanese radio broadcast, and they hear the bombing sirens come up, and everybody cheers and that kind of thing. So anyway, that's his movie, and it turned out well for him. First of all, they paid for all the FedEx packing and shipping, and and they sent the radio back maybe a week later, and also they paid him $150, and also they had bought another radio from somewhere else as a backup in case John's didn't show. And so they gave him the other radio as well. So John did real well about that. Plus, he has a great story to tell his grandkids now. So, so back to Pan Am radios. I'm still looking for real Pan Am radios, even though the filming is long gone. Here's the two items on the top are Pan Am transmitters of circa 1937 on the left, top left, 1939 on the top right. Again, manufactured in-house. A small beacon transmitter in the bottom left picture, and it was put in service April of 37. Again, a homebrew. And there's a very complex receiver, which was the next model receiver than the little ATM receiver that we saw earlier. And this was like the heyday of the Pan Am in-house manufacturing. This is a very complex receiver. You hook up all sorts of antennas. It does direction finding. It does beacon finding. It does regular. It's crystal controlled. It's on and on. So, and I have one of those examples as well. And I keep looking for these, and we found one of these down in the Dominican Republic in an antique radio collection. Beautiful example. I tried to buy it, and the guy just laughed at me. So there you go. And here's some inside pictures. There you can see the single coil in the plugged in, and it has a logging scale on the top right corner, national dials, and this is a calibration scale that's inside each of the radios as well. So this one just showed up on Facebook about 2 months ago. It's that same ATM radio, but someone has changed the national dials with these slightly later big vernier dials. And, and I could see this happening because those national dials did break, and this would give the radio operator much finer control. But it's been modified, and I was not able to purchase this one either. So that makes 3 we found. I did finally find one that I could buy. And even though it looks like it's been underwater, okay? And the reason why it looks that way, it has been underwater, okay? And I'll explain that in a second, but you can see the coils. I got almost a full set of coils with this radio. So this, I bought it from a airline memorabilia collector. He got this early 1997, bought it from a George Masterson, which he was a Pan Am aircraft radio operator. So he was one of the flight radio operators. And he says this radio was salvaged from a wrecked clipper, an airplane, off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. And so he gave me this nice letter. And so this, it turns out it was in a not a 4-engined S-42, but this is a 2-engine S-43, but they called it a baby clipper, if you will, because Pan Am called all their aircraft clippers, like the old clipper ships of old. And so anyway, my and here's the I was able to track down the aircraft. This was plane crashed in August 13, 1939. What happened? They were coming in to land and they lost an engine, and that particular type of airplane was uh, very hard to handle um, if you lost an engine at the wrong time, and that's exactly what happened. And there was some 16 people on board, and I think 13 died, and the other two were injured, and all that. And plane sunk, and it was sunk for just a few days. But this radio was salvaged at that time. Also, the tail number of that aircraft was NC 16933, and the call sign of that aircraft was KHBCM. Well, in another book, I recently found a picture of the radio in the airplane and in the Sikorsky S-43 Baby Clipper. So that's pretty good. And I also, with the radio, I got the trailing antenna weight, which was actually 2 pounds of lead, and this would hold the crank out long wire antenna that the planes all had, so they could talk on like 500 kilohertz, the low frequency. And but of course, they had to remember to crank the antenna back in before they landed, and many times people did not do that, and so they lost a lot of these antenna weights. But this also came from that same crash. Now, I keep looking for other variants, other Pan Am radios, and this one's in a museum at the Denver, Colorado airport, I believe. And this is a model ATM receiver, except it does not have the storage for the coils on the top. So it's just a little different variant than, and back, only in the last year or so have I come across any real Pan Am SW3s. Turns out one's at the San Francisco Airport Museum, and this is it. It probably came out of Alameda, and it actually has two data tags on the. It has the older one on the front right, and then the slightly newer one, late 30s, in the top center. And you'll notice it also has an on-off switch on the left corner of the receiver, and a headphone jack on the right. And this was good additions to the radio, and also it has the logging scale. So that's what Pan Am added. So this was the first real Pan Am SWC I ever found. It's in a museum. Well, I found one recently, and I finally got myself one. This came out of an estate in Washington State. Guy had hundreds of radios, and I just happened to notice in a picture he had two SW3s side by side. One had this logging scale and an on-off switch and headphone jacks, and the other one didn't. And I couldn't see if it had a data tag on the top because there was other radios sitting on top of it. So I begged and begged and begged a buddy of mine to attend this auction, and he did. And I got so I have so this is only the second one that we found. And the other thing is, I was just recently able to purchase a stock RCA AR-1496, which I'm still trying to get going here. But at least this gives me I mean, Pan Am did use some of the stock ones early on, but then later on they started modifying them to make them better and more appropriate to their use. So I can use this to help me study pictures of the other. So, and I'm still collecting pictures. Here's another unidentified radio model that I'm not sure what is yet. We haven't found one of those. And here's a flight radio operator using a bug in an aircraft. So if anybody ever, and he also has some straight keys, some McElroy straight keys behind his hand there as well. So they did use Vibraplex bugs up in the airplane when conditions allowed. So I've got a couple of follow-up presentations I'd be glad to do. The main one talking about the Pan Am high frequency direction finding. I've got a lot more detail about that if y'all want to hear that sometime. Stephen Lyons unfortunately passed away in 2020, but at least he got the documentary out. And here's my contact info. I'm really not a radio collector. I'm a radio picture collector, but I have a few radios as well. If you ever come across any, I love a radio, an uncommon radio with a good story, and something I can put a presentation around. So if you ever come across anything and you think of me, tell Neil, and maybe Neil and we can do something. And if you haven't watched Across the Pacific, the 3 hour series, please do. And that's it for me.